Hey everybody, my name is Gabe Rodriguez. I work for Provar. I'm going to be taking you through, along with my colleague Michael Dailey, a presentation that was targeted at the STARWEST community, specifically the quality assurance testers. What we want to show you is how Provar can help accelerate your time to deployment from Salesforce features all the way out into production with some automated testing. Like I said, my name is Gabe Rodriguez. I've been a software developer for about 15 years. I support Provar in a role that sits between product and engineering, helping ensure that folks understand what Provar can bring to the table in terms of a capability set and how we can integrate that into existing processes. I'm going to turn it over to my friend Michael Dailey to go ahead and introduce himself.
Thanks, Gabe. As Gabe said, my name is Michael Dailey, and I'm a solution architect here at Provar. I've been here for about 2.5 years now, and my primary role is working with our existing clients and as well as onboarding new clients and helping them with their CI/CD setup and integrations with third-party tooling. Previously, before joining Provar, I had the opportunity of working on the DevOps team and was a test automation solution engineer. And I also helped with our custom CI/CD setup and integrating our test automation into that. So I'll be playing the role as a QA in our demo that we're going to be walking you through in a real world business scenario. And Gabe's going to talk more about that here in just a second.
Thanks, Mike. So like Michael was saying, what we're going to do is show you an actual demonstration of how we can integrate Provar into a familiar lifecycle, such as the software development lifecycle that's depicted here. What you're going to see is we're going to make a modification to the Salesforce application, and we're going to promote that particular application change through a development lifecycle and all the way out into an end user. And you'll see that in the UI. The way that we intend to do this is to show Michael as a quality assurance persona, where he's written a series of tests that are going to first regression test what is already in the particular development org. And it's going to implement the testing to the changes that I'll be implementing as a developer persona. So the benefit of this is that as Salesforce features get implemented into a software development lifecycle, we're only testing against what the new features are. The feature set that has already been there should be regression test, and that should be done through an automation script, which is what Michael is going to be able to take you through and show you. And all of this should be implemented into an automated pipeline that'll help accelerate feature development from Salesforce all the way out to your users. So let's get started. We're going to turn it back over to Michael Dailey, and he's going to get you into the testing profile that we're going to show.
All right, so I'm going to be walking you through a demonstration of the Provar tooling. So what I'm going to be showing you here, for those of you that are already familiar, this is the Provar test builder. For those of you that aren't, you're going to be noticing my test steps are going to be laid out here, and the test step execution will show as well. So you'll see a pass here for all the green circles. That's every step that has been passed so far in my test case. So what I'm going to be doing, just to give you an overview, I'm going to be showing you an existing test case that I've already built out in this particular dev org against the Dreamhouse application. This Dreamhouse application is a Salesforce app on the App Exchange that you can find and download for free. This particular application has a couple of custom objects in it, such as the properties and brokers and things like that, so that you can basically look for a house and see who the broker is for that particular house and property and whatnot. And you could set different search filters and everything. So we're going to be showing you a use case that I've built out for this application where I'm going to be testing the search functionality of the Property Explorer page. Now, from Gabe's side of things, what he's going to be showing you is he's going to have access to my test suite. He's going to be able to run my test cases in an isolated Scratch org. So that's going to be the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about here. But really, I'm going to show you kind of what this test case is doing and also how we can add on to it. So the first thing that I've done, and if you've ever watched anything from me before, I always like to use test data. So all of my test data is laid out here. I've created some variables that I'm going to be reusing later on. Now, all of this data is actually going to be pulled from my Excel sheet. So following with our data-driven model in Provar, we always like to recommend data-driven testing when possible. We have an Excel sheet here that has all of my data that I'm going to be using for my testing. So along the top row here, this contains all of the fields that I'm going to be using and interacting with. And then the second row here contains my first row of actual data. So this is going to be all the different property data that I'm going to be using for my test case. I have another sheet here where I have a broker sheet basically, and it shows all of the fields here at the top. And again, the second row shows all of the broker data that's going to be utilized in my test case. So I like to outline all of my test data in such a way so that way I can add more rows. So if I want to run the same test case or scenario for multiple different iterations of data, I can just simply add a new row of data and easily modify my tests to accommodate that. I can also change the data here directly in my Excel sheet if I want this to basically change how my test case executes, right? So for now, I'm just showing you that data. Let's jump back over to my use case. All right, so far all I've done is I've read in the data from that Excel sheet, creating those values here. And now I'm going to jump into the first block here where I'm going to be setting my search criteria. Now what you'll notice here is I actually have a conditional statement. For those of you that are familiar with if conditions, basically I set a parameter here or a condition to evaluate, and based on the end result of that condition, we're going to do one of two things. Now in this case, I'm searching for a property, and I'm basically saying if a property has been created, then I'm going to do this else statement here. In this case, we're just running this test case on its own. It is a callable test case. So the reason I have this conditional in here is if I want to use this same test case from another test scenario, I can easily reuse this same scenario in other places and pass in whether or not a property has been created. I don't want to specifically search for it. For now, we're going to be actually just utilizing an existing property based on the data that is already in the org. So I'm going to resume this test case and show you what that looks like. So again, the property has not been created, so we're going to jump into this first block of code here. So we're going to jump to the Property Explorer page, and we're setting a couple of things for the search criteria. Number one, we're setting the search key field to Cambridge, and then we're going to be adjusting the max price from 1.2 million to 600,000. And then we're going to be setting the count of the number of bedrooms to 3. So this should minimize the number of properties that we see here. So we now only have 3 visible properties here. So what we're going to do next is we're going to navigate to the property page. I have all of my steps outlined in group steps. So for this particular scenario, you can see with everything collapsed exactly what the test case is doing. So this goes along with our best practices. You should always build out test cases in Provar in such a way that you can easily read them when everything is collapsed like that. Okay, so if I click resume again, we're going to click on this first tile here, and then it's going to expand it on the right side of my page. What that's going to do is load the property on the right side here along with the little Google Maps image here. And then if we click this expand icon, which we've already mapped out this step here, it's going to navigate us to the property page. So by the end of this group step, we have navigated to the property page. So far so good. The next step is to verify all the property details. So we're basically going to be validating all of these details in the UI as it appears. A lot of these details we're validating with data that we've populated from our spreadsheet and also in our setup test data group step here. So I'm just going to head and resume this through. You won't actually see anything really happening in the UI because all it's doing is reading values from the page and comparing them to a value that I've set up ahead of time. So you'll see these steps scroll through here. We're basically just reading in different values and we're validating things like the asking price, the number of bathrooms, the bedrooms, the state, and the city. Once all of the validations have been complete, there we go. Our next step is we can add on more to this test case, right? So we've only validated a few things, but what if we wanted to validate something in this little broker card here? So what I can do is I can actually right click on the broker name and add it to my test case. Now, what you'll notice in Provar, for those of you that have used Provar before or may be familiar with it, this is a slightly different view than you may be used to seeing. Because this is a Lightning Web Component, what you'll notice is Provar actually does recognize the fact that it is a Flexi component in this case, and it even is going to create a brand new page object for me. In this case, the only thing I really need to provide to the test builder is the name of the field that I'm mapping. So in this case, I'm mapping the broker name. So I'm just going to type that in there. For the field locator, Provar provides a pre-selected list of field locators for you to choose from. So you don't have to figure this out on your own. This is another added benefit of using Provar in something like the Dreamhouse application, which is very heavily customized. It's very heavily Lightning Web Component in terms of its implementation. So this Provar X feature will allow us to interact with Lightning Web Components very easily. So we're going to use that default locator that Provar has given us. Now, it's worth noting here that if this were not a Lightning Web Component, if this was just a standard Salesforce component and it was a custom object or something to that effect, we wouldn't have to be selecting a field locator here at all, because Provar would be built directly on the Salesforce metadata and using that metadata to influence how the locator is going to be found at runtime. But because it is a Lightning Web Component, we're able to use this custom field locator here. Now, this is going to be a pretty robust field locator because it's built directly on the LWC component itself. So I can be confident in that one and that it's going to work. Another way you can know whether or not the locator is working properly is you'll have a red indicator here in the UI signifying that that field has been located by the locator you have. Okay, the next thing I need to tell Provar in the test builder is what type of interaction do I want to perform. In this case, I'm doing a read assert. A read assert is basically all of those steps that I was doing previously where I was validating things in the UI. So I'm going to read something from the UI and I'm going to assert the value. In this case, it automatically pulls in the value from the page at that point in time. But we don't want to use a hard-coded value because we're trying to use best practices here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Control Space on my keyboard and I'm going to look for my broker name. Here we go. So this property broker field should contain the value that I expect here because I've set this up ahead of time. But basically this is making things to where if I want to change this value to another broker in the future, I don't have to change my test case. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click Add and Do. And Provar is going to add another section to my test case here where it's going to add this step to validate the broker name. So as it's performing that UI assert, again, it's just reading the value from the UI and it's comparing it to my variable that I created previously. Now again, with going with best practices, I always like to rename my test steps. You can do so by right-clicking the test step and renaming it here. Because I'm looking at this particular test step, if this step were to fail, all we would see is that UI assert was a failure and we would maybe have a screenshot in the UI of what failed. But I like to give my testers and my developers a little bit more information on what we're doing here. So I'll type in validate broker name. So it's very clear exactly what we're doing in this test step. All right, perfect. So this step has already been executed as well as built into my test case. So I was able to run an existing test case, see it actually execute live, and then add a new test step and validate that instantly. So there's a lot of value in being able to build a test case out as you're executing it. So once I have this scenario built out, the next step is going to be, I'm going to basically push up my changes that I've made to this test case into a GitHub repository where my colleague Gabe is going to be doing a pull of my changes, and he's going to be doing his own development to see if he can build out a new component or a modify to an existing component and run my test cases in his environment. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of my test builder here. All right, great. So once that has been closed out, I'm back in my desktop, my Provar Studio here, and this is the test case that I was working on here, the search properties test case. I have another one here where I'm creating a new property. For this particular scenario, we're only going to be performing the search functionality. So what I've done, in addition to kind of set up Gabe for success here, is I've created a test plan, and I've labeled it as such, regression plan. And basically this regression plan is going to run the Dreamhouse application test cases that I've created. So I'm letting Gabe know, hey, this is the name of my test plan from the Provar side, from the actual development side of things. Here's the test plan you're going to be targeting for execution. So all this is checked in. The only change that I really need to make was my new page object that I generated here, and then also my changes to my test case itself. So I'm going to go ahead and add those changes to my stage changes in Git. those two files there. And then the last thing I want to do is add in a message here and say, added new test step to verify broker name. Okay. So then I'm going to go ahead and do a commit and push. All right. So what this is going to do is it's going to push my changes up to a GitHub repository. So I've just updated my test case so that way Gabe can view that change and he can test it in his environment. So Gabe, I'm going to change it over to you where we can show the developer perspective.
Hey, thanks, Mike, for that demo. So what did we just see? So Michael just talked you through the process of assuming a quality assurance persona. In that quality assurance persona, he utilized Provar to write a series of automated test cases. Now, the important thing that needs to be articulated in Mike's demo to this transition that you're about to see, where I'm going to assume the developer role and carry on through the rest of this particular demonstration, is that Michael implemented all of his test cases in another org. Here, what we're trying to do is utilize a development org, a scratch org. And in this scratch org, can we still use everything that Michael had already shown us? And the answer is yes. The way we're going to do that is through this particular demo. We're going to show you that we can take a new business requirement. We can modify this particular filter Lightning Web Component, which was incorrectly labeled foobar, and it needs to say bathrooms, right? So that way that the bathrooms filter can filter houses that have X number of bathrooms within the home. We need to filter this in a scratch org where we can execute all of our tests, all the tests that Mike had already shown you, plus this incremental test that we're going to need to write to ensure that this particular feature was in fact implemented correctly. So we'll get into that next. What you'll see is a directory structure in Visual Studio Code that will show you the project structure that Michael had in his org where he was executing his tests. We are going to use that in our Scratch org, implement all of his regression, and add that particular test to ensure that this correctly states bathrooms. So to get started in the developer persona demonstration, the first thing that we have to address are some dependencies around our local environment in order to set these up and to make sure that the remainder of our test can in fact be executed. There's a handful of dependencies that need to happen, the first of which is to ensure that you have the SFDX command line tool installed. This comes from Salesforce. Additionally, you're going to want to, within your particular editor, you're going to want to add our Provar DX extension here. With the Provar extension and the Salesforce CLI tool installed, what you'll see then is that from Mike's demonstration, here is the Provar project that we've pulled in via a Git pull to our local environment. So that's probably another dependency, is being able to have access to the particular source code repo that houses the test scripts that are ultimately run from the other org. Once you have all that information, or once you have that environment configured, what you're going to be able to do is execute a series of these commands. One other thing that you're going to ensure needs to be in place for the Provar project to utilize our Ant command line tool is a configuration file. So here, what you see is a JSON configuration that will ensure that the Provar project that we implemented from Michael's test cases can in fact utilize the Ant CLI and execute the test cases found within the Provar project. So now that we have the dependencies installed and validated, there are a series of commands that we need to run in order to execute the changes. So this particular bash script we pulled together that captures all these particular initial setup that we're going to actually accomplish. As we had said before, Mike had been using a different org. We are in a Scratch org called STARWEST, where we're trying to implement this particular change. And so to set up a dev hub and a Scratch org, we needed to execute a series of steps to be able to do that. And those are captured here. That's also where we're going to begin the rest of our changes. So the first thing that we want to do is just ensure that we've set up a dev hub and a Scratch org. And you can see by running this particular command that we have a dev hub and we have a Scratch org. Now what we need to do is pull all the changes from the source code repository that Mike had initiated his changes to in his particular portion of the video. So if we execute a git pull, we will pull down those particular changes. So you can see that in Michael's demonstration, he modified his broker card, and that's one of the changes that we ultimately pulled down. So now that we've pulled Michael's changes into this particular project, what we can now do is go through the process of changing that particular LWC component to reflect what the business requirements were. So again, we're changing foobar over to bathrooms within our Scratch org called STARWEST. So here, if we go to our project, which is Dreamhouse LWC, and we navigate over to that particular source code file, which is going to be found in Force App main LWC, and then the property filters folder, in the property filter HTML, you're going to see that foobar. And so we need to change this to bathrooms, which we just have. Now we're going to save this, and we're going to go back to our commands. So we've just completed this nav and changed of that particular file. We're going to CD into our Dreamhouse directory, and we are now going to ensure that we push that particular change into our STARWEST Scratch org. So if we execute this particular command, we can now push those changes that we just made. This change that I'm referring to is changing from the foobar wording into the bathrooms wording. So you can see that that was completed successfully. And so now what we want to do is CD back up to the root parent directory, which is Provar demo. And we can do that by CD ... And now we're in the Provar demo directory. And we want to run the final command for this particular portion of these changes, which is right here, which is we want to compile the changes that we pulled down from Michael's org. As it was indicated up here, we've had a broker card change within his particular org that we pulled in. We need to compile those particular changes, and this particular command will execute that compile. So if we run this, you can see that it is now compiled. So now that all those changes have been committed, the last step is to go ahead and run the particular test. What are you doing when you run these tests? Well, recall that the Scratch org is separate than the org that Michael was using when he had his test suite. And so what we want to do is we want to ensure that we can run the tests within our Scratch org that Michael had in his particular org. To execute that, we're going to run this particular SFDC Provar run tests. And what you'll see is a browser initiate, and all the configuration that we've provided to it so far, along with our change from foobar to bathrooms, is now going to be implemented. So let's go ahead and run that. It'll ask if you want to continue. And you can start to see that it's executing the particular test. So as we watch these logs generate, what you're going to see is a browser window initiate. And so you can see that the first thing we can see is that that bathrooms change has in fact been implemented within our UI. Again, recall what we're doing. As a developer persona, we want to ensure that that particular test or that particular change was in fact implemented in an isolated org that doesn't affect production users. And so we can see that within our Scratch org, STARWEST, we've made that change. And you can also see that there's the beginnings of the test suite that we've incorporated from Michael in our Scratch org actually executing. So these changes that are actually happening on the UI aren't something that I'm doing. It's the actual test suite executing within our Scratch org. The Provar project that we incorporated from Michael is now being implemented within our Scratch org, allowing for the developer to go through the process of invalidating that all of his tests can be regression tested against. And the only incremental change should be that new feature that we just added, which is the change from foobar to bathrooms. So what this is effectively doing for you is ensuring that there's no manual regression that needs to happen. All of that is automated, and all of that is implemented with the test scripts that we incorporated from Michael's earlier demo. So now that that's all going on in the UI, the developer can come back to the integrated development environment, and in the console output, you can see all the associated logs with the execution of that particular test. Additionally, you can go into the Provar project, and again, remember what this is. This is the quality assurance test scripts that we borrowed from Michael in his particular org. We imported those through a Git pull, and now that we have them within our particular Scratch org, we can go to the directory structure here, and in this particular case, you'd find them in the Ant folder. You can see that we've run the test a couple of times, so in this particular case, the latest number here, results 2, would show me an index.html file, so I could go here to the index.html file, and within the Visual Studio IDE, I can open with Live Server, and you would see the output of that execution. So now you can see, once you've selected that particular results folder, that we provide you with some reporting output here. You can go and click into this test case properties file, and you can see all the execution in whatever detail you choose to investigate within this particular output. So you get test screenshots, you get console log files. All of this is something that I want to remind you that we've borrowed from another developer org. We've implemented within a developer persona local test environment. The benefit of that was we were able to execute regression across all the changes. All the changes that Michael has had since being a quality assurance persona are now incorporated into my single Lightning Web Component update. The benefit of this to the enterprise is that regression is no kidding end to end at this point. I get to borrow all the previous test cases that were previously implemented, ensuring that we continue to test against those, even though that the incremental change in this case happened to be a heading on the filter Lightning Web Component. We still get 100% regression and additional test coverage over our Salesforce organization. So that wraps up my demonstration. I'm going to throw it back over to Michael for some concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Gabe. So I'm going to go over an overview of what you all just saw in the presentation. So at the very beginning, we began with an existing test script, which was searching for properties in the Dreamhouse application. We then showed you how we can make a simple modification to that test case and verify that we still had a passing test case at the end. Since our test case was passing and we were satisfied with the change that we've made to the test, we pushed our changes to our GitHub repository. From there, we collaborated with our developer to let him know. In this case, we worked with Gabe. So Gabe was able to pull down our test project to his local environment where he had set up a Scratch org with a similar Dreamhouse application deployed to it. From there, Gabe can make his own changes, whatever they may be, to his isolated Scratch org environment, and he can run our regression suite against his changes in that environment. Again, the big benefit here is that we're working in isolation. Any development changes that Gabe is making and pushing to his Scratch org are not going to affect the active regression going on in the QA environment where the QA myself is going to be working. This is our intended outcome. What we're trying to do is we're trying to limit the ownership cost of new features. Essentially, we want to see more of the downward trend and less of the step function, where we see the red line here, where it's showing basically as you want to incorporate a new feature into your organization, you either have to hire a new team or you have to add more members to the existing team to accommodate that feature. What we really want to see is the downward trend, where as we add one or more features and we want to perform more feature development, we don't have to have as much ownership of that because all of the regression testing is covering our previous feature development. So the ideal goal is that each new feature would be the only thing that we're really needing to accommodate. In that case, we would need to write a new regression test to handle that new feature, and that's the only thing we would need to do in order to basically say that we have signed off on that change and it's ready to go to production. Because again, the end result is we want everybody to push more features out the door at a more rapid pace. That's the ultimate goal. As Provar, we are experts in test automation, and we can help you accomplish that. Please reach out to us if you have any questions with that or with the presentation. Thank you so much for watching.